Everybody, and welcome back to Hall 1 and the start of the next presentation here. I have the honor to introduce Robin Kirkpatrick to you. Robin has been a diver since the 70s, I assume. He says so. And he has been in love with wrecks. He's now a happy diver, diving whatever, whenever. His speech will be about has the title Commercial Diving Incident, Lessons for Technical and Recreational Divers. And he will speak about a number of human and organizational performance factors resulted in a near-fatal DSC incident during a surface-supplied air range commercial dive. And his presentation provides an invaluable insight drawing clear parallels with recreational and technical diving. So, Robin, very much welcome to this stage, and we are all looking forward to your presentation. I just want to ask you participants to think about your questions, and at the end of the presentation, move yourself to the I have a question table to be able to step up on the stage and join Robin and me and have a dialogue about his presentation. So, Robin, the stage is yours.
Anders, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, and in recognition of the truly international nature of this conference, I think it's only appropriate to wish everyone a very good morning, afternoon, or evening as appropriate. Anders has kindly given an introduction, and I'm just going to repeat some of that. My name is Robin Kirkpatrick. I've been a diver since the 1970s, and I regularly dive and instruct. Plus, my main interest these days is typically long runtime wreck diving. I frequently switch between closed circuit, open circuit, air, nitrox, mixed gas. I basically enjoy a wide range of diving. Diving is diving, right? In a sense, that is what this presentation is about. It is built around a commercial diving incident, but is, as I hope you can see over the next 30 minutes or so, all about the many aspects of diving that are common to us all, no matter what form of diving we're engaged in. Now, before I go any further, and by way of disclosure, it's important for me to state that I'm not a commercial diver. You may well ask, why then am I exploring this particular subject with you today? Further background. Much of my working life has been, and in fact still is, centered on the maritime and offshore energy industries. I was a ship captain for many years in command of vessels involved in subsea operations. I then moved ashore and into the corporate world, but still actively engaged in subsea activities, including ownership, management, and operation of some very complex vessels, whose very existence was to support divers and diving operations. I became aware of this incident at the time of its occurrence. And as I watched from the sidelines, I saw an industry which at face value sets the gold standard in valuing people and respecting their well-being, but which in reality left this individual high and dry to fend for himself. I watched from the sidelines until I could no longer sit in silence, and I made contact with his father, a man for whom I have the utmost respect as a safety and best practice champion in the commercial diving industry, mainly through his position as Diving Global Technical Authority for a very large entity, BP. I've seen the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. And no, the last point is not aimed at my many commercial diver friends. It refers to some of the less savory aspects of diving operations worldwide. It is one particular example of this that I will be talking about today, with a view to us all learning something from it. Based on these images, and take some time to look at them, it may look like a complex and daunting prospect to you, but to the companies and divers involved, this was a routine job conducted in sheltered waters of a port in the Canary Islands. Now, how many times have we all heard the expression routine in the context of incidents? I know that I have, many, many times, but let's not digress, at least for the moment, because we will return to this point later. Using equipment and techniques not available to many of us in the recreational and technical diving communities, the plan was to execute the work based on a solid foundation, diver skills and competency, all set against a substantial and prescriptive management system, policies, procedures, processes, and work instructions. 5 dives conducted over 4 days. What could possibly go wrong? Often paraphrased to "no plan survives first contact with the enemy," Prussian military commander Helmut von Moltke recognized that reality has a unique way of messing up plans, and he advocated having a series of plans rather than reliance on one. The company involved in this incident, its managers and supervisors, sadly did not follow that sage advice and instead elected to modify their work plans, effectively on the fly. The outcome, I have to say, was somewhat predictable. Having cited the company's own incident investigation report and talked extensively to the injured party, it is obvious that events started to deviate from plan within 12 hours of the first diver entering the water. This then triggered a series of quick reactions rather than carefully considered responses, which led cumulatively to a near-fatal incident occurring. Now, this is all very antiseptic and anodyne so far, you may be thinking, and you're absolutely right, and I will now address that. In December 2018, a young, fit and healthy commercial diver suffered near-fatal injuries arising from a poorly managed series of dives using so-called no-stop, no-decompression tables. 5 days of almost constant change and increasing uncertainty caused by a myriad of factors led to Lewis Beddoes surfacing from his 5th dive and almost immediately losing his sight, hearing, and ability to walk. He was fighting for his life. His mind, however, was still active. As a trained diver medic technician, Lewis knew exactly what was happening to him. He also knew precisely what his team should be doing to help him. He could not, however, communicate this. Strapped immobile into a stretcher, he was manhandled across boats and quaysides. He had his body and face battered by rough handling. He was laid face down in his own vomit. And at one point, as he was being lifted across water from a boat to quayside, he thought, "They are likely to drop me here, and I don't want to die like this, drowned, strapped immobile to a stretcher." Can you imagine this? His story is one of a shocking sequence of abysmal choices and poor decisions made by others that have left Lewis trying to rebuild his life. And that story will be told in full at another time. The choices and decisions made as all these events unfolded are also quite likely to be encountered during recreation and technical diving. And this is what I want to talk to you about today. We're now going to look at some key aspects, which will, I'm sure, be very familiar to you. And as such, I would like you to at least try to relate each aspect to your own diving. Now, I don't know what you do or how you do it, diving related. Only you can know that. But try to translate these into the diving situations that you typically encounter. You do all your equipment checks. You have your equipment serviced regularly. You possibly have backup equipment, which I'm sure you also check and have serviced. You plan and execute your dive within limits prescribed by known and trusted tables or using your preferred dive planning software. You may even use these tools to contingency plan for 5 minutes longer, 5 meters deeper, or some other combination. You may find yourself stepping outside of your planned profile and having to deal with the consequences. Chosen reef, shore, wreck, cave, boat, or drift dives may challenge you as the situation changes, taking you outside of your own comfort zone, or indeed it may challenge others in your group based on their experience. Pressure to dive. Now, we have all experienced this, I'm sure. I know that I have. And I also freely admit to giving into it on occasion when in my heart I knew that it was not a smart decision. But hey, the fact that I'm here today shows that I got away with it. But I ask you, is that really a smart way to dive? More pressure to dive. Slack water, rain-induced cave flow, approaching marine weather systems, flood or ebb tide egress and access considerations. Last one to kit up and holding up the dive, glowering looks directed at you. Grumpy boat skipper thinking about his or her commercial interests. You've all been there many, many times, I'm sure, and these are realities. Let's remember one more. Mixed groups comprising different nationalities and cultures. Some cultures fostering the gung-ho, let's get this done attitude. Others making it difficult to speak up and challenge and say no. That's a hard one sometimes, isn't it? What happens when the cultures combine? Especially when one is in an actual or perceived leadership role. Language variations and the level of certainty of understanding can create further uncertainty. Post-dive, do you debrief? And is it truly an honest debrief? I'll leave you with that question. Are you naturally disposed to be a leader or a follower? If a follower, do you default to conforming with leader diktat? Or are you able to challenge? If a leader placed in a follower role, do you handle that well? I freely admit to you that I can struggle with that latter point. Last but certainly not least, when things go wrong, how confident are you in your own abilities, and very importantly, those of the group, to effectively manage the situation? How do you test this confidence? Do you in fact test it? We're now going to look at some factors which I believe are common to all scenarios in the context of human behavior. I refer to them as the 10 coms and cons. Now, before I go any further, it's important to state that the incident we're referring to is currently subject to legal proceedings. And that means we will not explore any of the actual incident, but instead use them to relate to our recreational and technical diving. They all apply at different levels and in different ways. However, please remember these illustrations are only that, illustrations. You will be able to relate your own experiences to each one, I'm sure. Contractual. Dive trip terms and conditions. Trip disclaimers. Your rights and your obligations. The trip organizer rights and obligations. Diving is not a low-cost sport. I think we are all aware of that. Training, equipment, travel, maintenance, it can all add up to a substantial sum. And getting a return on your substantial investment can perhaps push you to making decisions, which all things being equal, you would probably not otherwise make. Being qualified is one thing. Building upon initial training to establish ever-increasing levels of competence, however, takes time. Has that time been invested for the trip or the dive in question? It's a question I ask before every dive I make, and sometimes I'm surprised by the results. If the dive or trip objective is further training, have you chosen the best instructor for you? And this is a somewhat topical comment of the moment. If you're an instructor, have you effectively evaluated trainee ability prior to course commencement? Two important questions. Confidence can be a great thing. It can also be the source of many issues, whether through overconfidence or indeed underconfidence. But whatever level, has it been recognised, and is it being considered as part of the dive planning? Stepping outside of the confidence consideration and looking at complacency. Has a level of complacency built up due to, say, site or dive team familiarity? It's so easy for this to creep in, and it is one to watch. Thinking about the skills required for the dive, how far are you from what you perhaps consider the skill level necessary for the dive or trip? If there is a gap, no matter how big, is it something you can talk about within the group or with the organisers? I know on occasion I found it difficult to do so. Compliance. You've already heard quite a lot in Hall 1 on the subject, and you're going to hear more over the remainder of today and tomorrow. Compliance crops up all the time, increasingly so. Closely linked to the first topic we considered, that of contractual obligations. If there are legal obligations placed on you, are you in fact fully aware of these? And can you comply? Conformance. This is less legal imperative, more guidelines and standards, and probably of more significance to us in the recreational and technical diving communities. Agency standards, trip or site rules for safe diving. How do you view these? Now, each and every one of these influencing factors is important. And I know this is a particularly observant audience, and that you will have noticed that so far I've only addressed 8 of the stated 10. So let's now look at the last 2, which in my view are the 2 most important. Conflict may be between the boat skipper and the dive leader. It may be within the team. It may be with or between any of the many stakeholders involved in your diving. How is it managed? Do you have the competence and confidence to do so? Or do you actually rely on others to do so? If so, who is it that you rely on as role model and spokesperson? And finally, communication. In my professional life, I've been involved in many incident investigations over the years, and communication is almost always identified as a key component. Is what you are hearing what the speaker thinks is being transmitted? Is what you are saying what is being heard? Do you use and recognize non-verbal communication cues and clues? So looking at each of these 10 factors that we have just walked through, looking at them from a similar perspective and approaching your own diving and thinking in this way, Is there a chance, do you think, that it could modify your behaviour or perhaps that of others? And if so, would that then lead to your desired or preferred outcome? And if not, how would you address that? It is quite complicated, isn't it? And here's another question for us. Do these factors exist alone, or do they, in fact, interact and affect others? Small Wars, Big Data, the Information Revolution and Modern Conflict by Messrs. Berman, Felter and Shapiro. A wonderful book, very informative book, looking at the effects of different aspects of conflict and their interaction. And reading this, it made me think about the complexity of diving and how the various diving factors relate dynamically. Does each component part stand on its own merits and thus exercise its own direct influence on an outcome? There are the 10 C's with an R as a resultant. Or are at least some of the components influenced by others and thus combined to determine an outcome? In the real world, it is likely that at least some of the factors do influence others, resulting in significant complexity as the number of relationships increase. Now, this is definitely a topic in its own right, and one that I'm sure will occupy the minds of many as we move forwards to developing a better understanding of how human factors affect what we do in our diving. And on this topic, in a recent exercise with Gareth and Professor Ivan Popility and a small group of like-minded people, we stepped into the wonderful world of network influence mapping. Network influence mapping. Remember it because you're going to hear more about that. Looking at decision-making by divers and the role of risk and uncertainty, this approach is, I'm sure, going to bring a new dimension to how we plan and execute our diving. I'm also sure that we will all be hearing much more in the not-too-distant future. However, let's return to the incident which reshaped Lewis's life, and in fact nearly robbed him of his life. I've been privileged to be able to talk at length with Lewis and his father, as well as been given access to material that they have been able to share. And quite unaware at the time of the work being done by Professor Popility on the subject of network influence mapping, I mapped out what I perceived to be the relevant factors which conspired together to produce this horrific incident outcome for Lewis. That map is illustrated here. Please don't be concerned about trying to read the detail. That is not the point of sharing this. What I want to do is to illustrate the relational complexity of factors which affect decision-making and which ultimately largely determine incident outcome. Altering one impacts on others and thus changes the outcome or the outcome's severity. As I've already said and alluded to, it sounds complex, and it is. But here's the good thing, it can be managed. Now, this map has been anonymized, but it captures the key elements which I believe conspire to affect the outcome of this particular incident. The C-suite, the 10 cons and coms are all captured in this map. And drilling down through each element reveals an amazing world of relational complexity. As already mentioned, detail here is not important. What is important is the sheer scale and interconnected nature of the elements, almost all of which can, do, and will exist in your own diving. I guarantee it. Now think about it. Not to the extent that I'm suggesting you don't get into the water. That would be ridiculous. But use it to inform your own decision-making and that of the group or team, whether in routine diving or indeed in an emergency situation. Use this approach to feed and inform your own input to planning, briefing, and debriefing. Use it to provide a learning platform, which in turn provides a continuous improvement route, as well as a tool for improved management of uncertainty and risk. Now, I have the benefit of sight and knowledge of the detail in this map, and I can tell you that the lower right part of the map is largely the domain of human factors. And we're now going to look at some of these in more detail in the context of what happened to Lewis and relate these once again to your own diving. I'm going to use the next 3 slides to bring recognized human factors in as a comparison linking Lewis's situation to that of your own diving. In doing so, it presents you with a number of questions which time does not permit us to discuss in full here, but which you can take away and consider at your own pace. I'm also going to use these slides to count down to a summary and a conclusion. Communication is central to everything that we do in our life. Effective communication is always strived for, but unfortunately rarely achieved. Aviation, for example, has arguably evolved to a point where it sets the gold standard for us all, and yet, even there we have incidents occurring in which communication is identified as having been, shall we say, less than effective. Teamwork is often spoken of, but unfortunately it is too easy to confuse a group of people with a team. Think about that statement. Teams require trust, and that can only be achieved through time, effort, and an open culture, which promotes transparency. In my corporate management consultancy world, I often come across so-called teams, which upon analysis are really groups of individuals placed together, usually by virtue of position or skill sets. And our diving world really is no different. Situation awareness is such a tough thing to define. It is so dynamic that by the time you have processed information, that same information may already have been modified due to other aspects changing. So identifying change rather than constancy can be key here. And this in turn loops back to, guess what? Communications. Let's look at some more. Work is imagined. What a fascinating topic. And it's one that can mean many things to many people. Even people all apparently on the same page, as they say. Our prejudices and our natural biases all come into play as we build our mental model based on actually the same information input, which means we really need to test the model repeatedly as we strive for alignment. Let's look at work as done. This is the reality. And the difference between this and work as imagined often determines the scale and scope of risk and uncertainty. And I would like you to think about that statement, and let's give it some context. Now stay with me on this, please, because I'm going to refer to some background aspects of Lewis's incident. The drilling rig owner had an obligation to have the rig surveyed and recertified at certain fixed periods, 2.5 and 5 years, in fact, for those who are interested. It was also mandated by a ship classification society, which determined the survey scope of work. Now, the rig owner could not do this work itself, so it looked for a diving contractor and invited a number to competitively tender for the work against the stated scope. I think you can see where this is going, but let me continue. The rig owner evaluated the tender responses against various criteria, including the contractor's ability to do the job, to manage it safely, and to provide it at an acceptable cost. The contract was awarded against a backdrop of industry downturn, which resulted in diving contractors bidding at low cost just to secure work. The rig owner awarded the work, having assured itself that it had vetted the contractor for its ability to do the job safely, on time, and within the budgeted cost. This, in other words, is the work as imagined by the rig owner. Now, the diving contractor is pleased, is delighted to have been awarded the work, and mobilises its people, plant, and equipment. It mobilises everything it believes is required to execute the scope of work as defined by the contract with the rig owner. It imagines the work will be completed on or within schedule and that there will be no delays or other issues. However, very quickly the schedule slips. The diving contractor quickly starts to make changes to try to recover the schedule. These changes prove ineffective, and it then introduces further change. This translates to pressure on the divers in the water actually working on specific tasks and conflicting obviously with their own initial work as imagined perspective. Now you can see how quickly a gap appears and grows between work as imagined and work as done, and the potential for hurt, harm, and chaos that this brings. You can also see, I'm sure, that as the schedule slips and a project slips from profit to loss, that there will be a significant chance of rules and best practices being bent, broken, or ignored. And this leads us to the next point. Drift for us as divers could be argued as a natural phenomenon caused by water movement. However, in the context of human behaviour, it's a remarkably common occurrence, even in supposedly highly regulated activities. Recognising it early determines how effective our actions will be when or if we're trying to bring activity back on track. Normalisation of deviance is a scarily insidious factor, but it is apparent in almost everything we do. We push boundaries and we get away with it, and this tempts us to repeat. We push this new boundary and we get away with that, and so on. And then at some point in the iteration, however, we don't get away with it. Now, I know the next speaker here in Hall 1 is going to talk about this in far greater depth and detail, and it is a discussion that I, for one, am going to be watching with great interest. Psychological safety is a topic easily stated, but which is incredibly difficult to achieve. Now, like many things, it comes in degrees, and the journey towards psychological safety can be lengthy. Definitely a series of steps rather than a giant leap. But these steps are, in my view, worth taking, and I would argue that they should be taken by us all. In my world, this concept of just culture was introduced probably about 30 years ago. At the time, I was a senior manager in a multinational corporation, and I can tell you that it was as poorly understood then as it is now. Some thought it meant that blame could never be apportioned. Some thought it gave them carte blanche to ignore the rules and do what they wanted to do. Others tried to embrace the concept but failed because the culture just was not there to permit its growth. 30 years on, it is much better in my world, I'm so pleased to say. But in the diving world, I would suggest that it is still very much in the embryonic stage. Contentious statement, perhaps, but it's something I believe. And the more we can all do to create an environment in which just culture is prevalent, the better it will be for all of us. So we've covered a lot of ground here, and I hope you found it interesting. I also hope that it has stimulated thought and given you a reason to be more inquisitive and to question what you do and how you do it. And this brings me to the point of summary and ultimately conclusion of this presentation. The background image here is a still taken from a video I took just a few short weeks ago. It is taken quite deep in a remote Scottish sea loch and was only possible after many years of research and detailed planning involving a close-knit team. As you may be able to see from the image, we did find our mark, and we now need to make sense of what we found, and this to me is what diving is all about. Hope you agree. Adventure, fun, camaraderie. We ticked all three boxes and many, many more besides on this expedition. Did it go to plan? I can almost hear you ask. Well, you won't be surprised when I tell you that it absolutely did not. Although I am pleased to say that nothing strayed significantly from plan. Did we recognize the departures from plan and debrief them in order to learn and implement that learning? We certainly did. But I have to tell you that as a team, we had to push ourselves at times to make that happen. Our nature predisposes most of us to adopt a narrow view, and this is particularly so when things don't go according to plan and stress levels rise. That, however, is no excuse for inaction. We have the ability to change this, and I believe we should grasp it. Now, this brief foray into the world of choices, mistakes, errors, and consequences based on an actual incident has, I hope, prompted you to look differently into your own decision-making and your behaviours in the wonderful realm of diving. It may even have prompted you to apply this to life outside of diving. I certainly do, and at that point, let me now bring this presentation to a conclusion. Lewis and his family want the lessons learned from his experience to be shared with others so that they can avoid the consequences that he is so valiantly battling. No matter what type of diving we do, human physiology, diving physics, and human behaviours are common to us all. And the aim of this presentation is to provide you with information that will stimulate discussion and help you and your fellow adventurers to become safer divers, and to do so by being inquisitive and, yes, even challenging. We hope that we have achieved that aim. Thank you. We now have time for questions.
Thank you very much, Robin. And thank you for a great presentation and an interesting way of using the findings you could take from this commercial diving incident or accident, as you could call it maybe. Please go to the I have a question table. I will pick you up from there and invite you to the stage with your questions so you could ask them directly to Robin. While you do that, you beloved participants, I have one first question for you, Robin, I think coming out of your presentation now. You pinpointed several key elements in this among the factors that can contribute to an accident or an incident. But if you think that one single thing could be changed in this chain of events that led to this incident, what would that be?
Oh my goodness.
Good question, don't you think?
I think it's a wonderful question, Anders. The short answer is a very simple one. It's yes. But as I think you've just seen, the real answer to this lies in the complexity and the relationship of each of these aspects, the relationships with one another. Let me go into that in more specifics. If, for example, the supervisor had placed Lewis in the hyperbaric chamber, which was on site, it would have given Lewis almost immediate symptomatic relief. Mm-hmm. All probability reduced the severity of his symptoms and almost certainly improved the outcome. However, the supervisor chose not to use this chamber, and this decision led to Lewis being denied treatment for over 6 hours. And even then, that was only after a helicopter flight, which probably introduced an altitude burden, never mind the time delay. Thinking again in more detail about Lewis's incident, if drift from the plan had been recognised early, Anders, and more importantly, been effectively addressed at the time, then perhaps there may have been no trigger for the DCS hit suffered by Lewis. I just don't know that, but I think it's a valid statement to make.
I think most of us can really get you there at the drift from plan. Mm. The point you make about that we have a tendency to accept that kind of changes in the reality realms surrounding the dive or the situation where we dive.
Yeah. And you know, as I got involved in this and was given fairly privileged access to some of the detail, I kept coming up with the same question, and this is familiar to human divers, human factors followers. If only. I kept thinking, if only supervisor had done this, if only the team had recognized that, if only. And that's what I'm left thinking about this incident.
But that's really a cultural aspect too, to be able to pose questions about that drift, the drift, especially if you have some kind of authorities or leaders or just the role models that you look up to in the dive community where you perform your dives, where the club you join or the trip you go to, the kind of organizers you are kind of aligned with.
You're absolutely right, and cultural change takes a long time. We know that there is no quick fix in saying let's change culture, and I think too. I'm also intrigued, and I'm by no means an expert on this. Many of the delegates and indeed many of the speakers know far more about this than I do. But the dynamics of culture change. In relation to the kind of diving that we're talking about, our recreational and technical diving, I see it happen all the time, every single dive.
I agree. Robin, we have Seb with us. I don't know if Seb is your full name or short for Sebastian or anything. Can you please tell us, Seb?
Yeah. Yes, it is short for Sebastian, but only my mum.
Good guess from my side then.
Only my mum called me that when I was in trouble, so I tend to use Seb.
Okay. We won't use your Sunday name then, Seb.
You're welcome, Seb.
I suppose I should explain just a little bit of background to my question, Robin, in that I, like you, am in both camps, having started for 9 years as a recreational diving instructor, and then 14 years ago jumped into the world of HSC commercial diving, and in fact worked with Lewis shortly after he came out of dive school. I was very sorry to hear about the incident, although most of what I've heard is through Facebook and through the networks and through the campaign to raise funds for him. One of the things that I've remarked upon to many people that I meet is just how different the culture is between, broadly we'll call it sport diving, and then even within the different commercial diving camps. If we take the construction and energy sectors as as sort of broadly the same, and then you have science and media as well, and police and military. There are all these individual cultures, and Anders' earliest question about a single point as well as being impossible. For me, the singular point is the culture that underpins all the specifics of everything that you were talking about. And in your investigation and your interaction with both the sport diving world and the commercial diving world and the commercial energy production world, how have you bridged that gap? Because for me, talking in one camp and bringing evidence or lessons from the other camp immediately invites rejection. It immediately invites, oh, we don't like in surface applied commercial diving. It's, oh, we don't do what Scooby does, the Scooby, blah, blah. And it's a frustrating instant barrier to having a conversation. I feel like I have to be more surreptitious when I talk about, for example, human factors.
Yeah.
And again, Gareth is an intersectional sort of mindset in this, coming from military and then offshore oil and gas, but there's also recreational diving. So this is how have you succeeded in breaking this culture war, this cultural barrier, so that we can better learn from each other? We talk about the medical industry, we talk about lessons from the aerospace and space, but this is still a really difficult barrier I find within the broadest diving community.
Yes, thank you so much for that, and also for the detail behind your question. The answer to your question is, have I broken that barrier? No.
Mm.
Have I and others started, and you, I think I would include in the group, have we actually started to take steps towards breaking those barriers? Yes, absolutely. I made the reference earlier in the discussion to a series of steps rather than a giant leap. And I think we are definitely taking some early steps in this cultural piece. But through those steps, I'm delighted to share, there's another speaker taking the floor tomorrow, saturation diver, and he and I have been working together. And his view as, let's say, the elite of the commercial diving world, refreshingly open to discussing the human aspects, to actually saying, you know what, we're all divers here at the end of the day. And those common factors that apply to us all, that I made reference to early in the discussion. And I think the more people we meet like that, the higher frequency and the larger numbers of engagements with people like that, then I think we'll start to make significant inroads to that cultural issue to which you refer, Seb. And is it going to take place over a month or over a year? It's going to take a long time. It's a year plus, for sure. But hopefully, Seb, we can hook up after this, because I would love to share with you more of what we're doing. There's a small group of us very actively involved in discussing and aiming to address that very wonderful question that you just asked.
I'd love that. We'd love to part of the discussion, because I think it is necessary. And again, occupying that boundary, that intersectional boundary between all the is a challenge in itself, before you even bring together all the hard work of individuals like yourself and Gareth and everyone else who was seeing this conference. So thank you very much for the presentation. A lot of it was irritatingly familiar, and I guess I'll see you in the lobby afterwards.
And thank you, Seb, for a nice summary of this speech, or this part of the conference. Robin, thank you very much for your attendance and your pregnant presentation. I hope you have a lot of people joining you in the main hall of this conference, where you will be in the area at the table for the speakers from Hall 1. shortly from now. You go there and meet other people. We have no more questions, so you are free to leave very soon. And I have to check if I have got any more footage from my son just training to become a commercial diver. I have to keep track of him too. Yeah. So
very topical answer.
I thought it was very interesting. Thank you very much, Robin, and bye-bye. And
Thank you.
for the rest of you, we'll be back on the top of the hour with the next presentation here in Hall 1, so please return. Bye-bye.